Hi, this is Whitney. I hope everyone's semesters are going well and that everyone is doing well. This is my presentation on my seminar paper, Angels and Monsters, which is an analysis of Rose O'Neill's Subversion of Victorian concepts of female sexuality. My paper works within the discipline of art history to examine how the artist Rose O'Neill developed her Cupid illustrations and sweet monster drawings to challenge early 20th century concepts of gender identity and women's sexuality as portrayed during the Victorian period. First, I expand on how she subverts repressive Victorian girl-child imagery by desexualizing images related to children through the universe of her androgynous Cupies, where she portrays positive expressions of girlhood and womanhood within the subject matter of these cartoons. Then I discuss how she subverts fallen woman imagery by portraying her sweet monsters as positive expressions of female sexuality rather than the demonizing representations found in imagery of the previous period. Finally, I connect these discussions by illustrating how both her commercial work with the Cupies and series artistic work with the Sweet Monsters were connected as she used both together to reform societal constructions of women's identity. In my paper, I especially emphasize the importance of understanding how O'Neill's work was in dialogue with gendered imagery from the Victorian period, as it reveals how her art is a reconstruction and reformation of these iconographic conceptualizations of women's identity. Now, the text and materials that I used in my analysis include a lot of primary sources. As it's an art historical paper, there's a lot of images of illustrations and drawings that I analyzed, including O'Neill's early cartoons when she was working at Puck magazine, her Cupid illustrations that she published in women's journals, and the sweet monster drawings that she exhibited in Paris. I also try and include an analysis of her literary works, as these two works mentioned kind of embody a lot of the same ideas as her sweet monster drawings. And then also I include an analysis or source material from her autobiography, as it's really insightful to how she conceptualized her sweet monsters and Cupies. I also use a lot of academic sources. I have quite a few books and essays that discuss O'Neill's work, typically in relation to gender studies and in art history. I also use essays discussing concepts of Victorian girl child and fallen woman to back up my analysis of these in relation to O'Neill. And finally, I conclude the paper really discussing Arbash, I'm sorry if I butchered her name, her Falling Alice, Fallen Woman, and Victorian Dream Children essay, which she discusses the fallen child. So a little bit about Rose O'Neill. She was born in 1874 in Pennsylvania, but eventually her family moved to Taney County, Missouri, just outside of Branson, where they lived at Bonnybrook, and this kind of became a home base for her, where she returned to continually to live and work. Her Irish-born father, William Patrick O'Neill, was the owner of a bookstore and art gallery when she was younger, and so she grew up reading books and viewing art that would later influence her own creations. She's often called the mother of the Cupies because that's what she's most well known for, is her creation of the Cupies. But she's also a commercial illustrator, serious fine artist known for her drawings and sculpture, and a published author. She was one of the most successful commercial female artists of her time, and at one time was considered to be one of the richest women in America. She used her art to create social satire, political commentary, and personal explorations of spirituality and womanhood. She was also a very well-known female activist and leading advocate for women's suffrage. She used her illustrative and artistic voice as well as her affluence to fight for women's rights. So first I discuss in the paper the concept of the angel child in relation to cupies. So a little bit about the angel child. As we discussed in class, it acted as a symbol of innocence and purity to a Victorian audience, derived from its connection to children who were believed to be inherently good and incorruptible. It represents adult objectification of children as artists appropriated child's bodies, most often young girls, to craft symbolic images of purity for their viewing pleasure, as nude depictions emphasize their moral and physical innocence. It's intended to police the behavior of adults who were expected to exhibit moral behavior modeled after these purifying images. They are charged. These images are charged with Victorian anxieties about sexuality and the threat of the female body. So the cupies, on the other hand, were developed by Rose O'Neill for the Ladies' Home Journal, where they were first featured. Over the next 25 years, her cupies continue to be published in many different women's journals. And in 1912, she began to sell cupie merchandise, so she was able to create a commercial enterprise that earned her a large fortune and spread the cupie image across America. Their good natures and moral behavior were depicted in the adventures they went on in O'Neill's cartoons, where they aided mystical creatures, troubled children, and adults alike. Although their childlike forms and generous actions, through these, the cupies developed into symbols of innocence and goodness, kind of like the angel child. Yet O'Neill subverts the angel child with her development of the cupies. Through these images, she challenged concepts of adult voyeurism and repressed sexuality by desexualizing the cupies. The narratives portrayed in her cartoons were intended to benefit their audience by subverting Victorian suppression and objectification of girls and women, embodied in their archetypal portrayal of the angel child, by creating an alternative representation of proper behavior that didn't involve the policing of sexuality or gender. The cupies exude morality not because they are innocent or pure, but because they are depicted as clever and kind. She also tackles subverting images of the fallen women. So images of fallen women, as seen in paintings of the Pre-Raphaelites, act as representations of female promiscuity. The women, as seen in this painting of The Lady of Shalott by Hunt, which we talked about in class, depict women as large, wild, powerful, threatening, and sometimes even monstrous. These images demonize female sexuality and were used to police the sexual behavior of Victorian women, as they acted as a threat of what could happen if they didn't remain chaste or pure. Like the angel child, these images are also charged with Victorian anxieties about sexuality and the threat of the female body. At the same time that O'Neill was creating and publishing her playful and more satirical commercial illustrative work, she was also crafting and developing these more serious drawings that she kept secret for a long time. The majority of her private work features large, sensuous Titan creatures that O'Neill affectionately called her sweet monsters. These drawings were first exhibited in Paris in 1921. She used expressive sculptural lines to create mythological-based images inspired by the Celtic myths her Irish-born father shared with her as a child. These primordial female giants explore concepts of primitivism, nature, spirituality, and sensuality as they express deep psychological states of emotion. So O'Neill uses these images to subvert Victorian portrayals of the fallen women because of her characterization of the sweet monsters, which are drawn as large and monster-like creatures, as gentle, loving, and sensuous women. This highly contrasts and contradicts Victorian depictions of sexually threatening women as giant monstrous creatures with negative connotations. So I wrap up my paper by connecting O'Neill's commercial work with the cupies and her serious artistic work with the sweet monsters by revealing how they were conceptualized and created in tandem and are both in dialogue with the same issues regarding female gender and sexuality that O'Neill was concerned with throughout her artistic career. She used these images together to reform societal constructions of women's identity. First, O'Neill developed her cupies to subvert Victorian girl-child imagery that represses female sexuality by creating positive and assertive portrayals of children and women in her cupie verse, which subverts the repression of female sexuality portrayed in Victorian girl-child imagery. Sorry, I think I got that sentence a little mixed up there. And she did this while also challenging Victorian concepts of female licentiousness that villainized women's sexuality as represented in fallen women imagery, by crafting images of large, powerful, and sensuous feminine creatures who are represented as caring and sweet. I connected O'Neill's use of this foil to challenge stereotypes of gender and female sexuality with similar Victorian uses of the dichotomous foil of the fallen child that are discussed in Auerbach's essay, Falling Alice, Fallen Women, and Victorian Dream Children. My paper illustrates how these seemingly dichotomous images, cupies and sweet monsters, work together to subvert Victorian gender stereotypes and redefine female sexuality. So in conclusion, I think my paper is an important addition to the scholarly discourse surrounding Victorian gender studies and early 20th century art history, as it contributes to discussions of women artists' agency in reforming their own artistic and social identity as expressed through their art. Women artists, especially from this period and earlier, have historically been underrepresented and their work misinterpreted. It is important to fully understand how their work defines and challenges cultural and societal concepts about women during the periods in which they worked. This is especially pertinent when discussing the artwork of Rose O'Neill, as she was one of the very few women artists of her time who was widely known and whose work was widely recognized. As she was a leading figure of the art world and predominant advocate for women's rights, it's essential to recognize the many ways in which her work impacted the societal view of women's identity, as well as how it expressed her own conceptualization of self. My paper adds to this discussion by clarifying how her commercial and serious artwork challenged preconceived concepts of women's identities and sexuality by subverting Victorian images with her own illustrations, drawings, and writings. Here's my source list if you'd like to view that. Thank you guys so much for listening.